He became second.
Oh, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bob Kelly, and welcome to our historic lecture series. This is put on by the Town of Victor's Historic Advisory Committee. We work with Babette Huber, who's a town historian, and we've been doing a series of talks that have gone on the last 4 or 5 years at least, maybe more. And I've learned more about local history over the last 5 years than I ever thought I would know, and more appreciate how much history really happened here. And so we're very pleased to welcome Chris Carosa, who is from Mendon, next town over, and has written a book about the visit by Lafayette, and we'll let him explain all the details now. Chris, thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'm going to start with, well, how many of you folks have gone to see movies? Yeah. What do they have at the beginning of movies? Coming attractions, previews. I'm going to give you a coming attraction. You should take notes because it will come up later in this presentation. So listen carefully. Let's see if this works. It's a shame when cousins marry. How else would you explain the hodgepodge of competing land claims wrought by the British kings of the colonial era? It began with Virginia. James I granted this first colony all lands up to the 45th line of latitude and included a portion of greater western New York. So, we're part of Virginia? But wait, in 1628, Charles I granted the Massachusetts Bay Colony all of North Virginia's land above the 42nd parallel, again extending to the South Seas. So now we're part of Massachusetts, right? Not so fast. In 1662, Charles II decided to create the Connecticut colony between the 41st and 42nd lines of latitude westward by 3,000 miles. The ensuing conflict between Connecticut and Pennsylvania would indirectly help define the greater western New York region. And when does New York even enter the picture? It enters when the same Charles II, who, completely forgetting what he had done 2 years earlier, in 1664 grants a royal patent to his brother James, the Duke of York. Get it? This royal patent gives James part of the lands previously deeded to Massachusetts and Connecticut. Can this get any more confusing? Yes, it can. In 1681, the Crown granted William Penn, the guy from whom we get the name Pennsylvania, land rights up through the 43rd parallel, thus sparing Mr. Penn from dealing with the vagaries of Lake effect snow from Lake Ontario. So there you go. A total of 5 counties, of which at any time 4 of them held competing claims on western New York. Eventually, and during the colonial era, 3 withdrew any pretensions for our beloved homeland. That left New York and Massachusetts both with legitimate, albeit awkward, rights to our region. It would take a controversial meeting in Hartford, Connecticut before the two sides would settle this debate. All right. So, was that clear or confusing? Confusing, right, because the words happen really fast. Well, that was done from an artistic standpoint to show you how confused everybody was about who owned Western New York. This is actually part of my project, whatever, not bicentennial, tetrasequicent, whatever it's called for next year. I'm doing some work on that, studying Western New York between the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, and I call it the 1786 Project. Do you know why I call it the 1786 Project? The end of that episode, which is only a minute, which is why I was going so fast, tells you why. Because on December 16th, 1786, New York and Massachusetts met in Hartford, Connecticut, for what we called the Treaty of Hartford. And that determined who owned Western New York. Pennsylvania owned the economic rights, New York owned the political rights. So the rest you'll have to read that book to see what happens there. But believe it or not, this is going to be somewhat relevant as we move forward. So let's start with what we've got cooking today. So this is my book. I'll be talking about this book, Lafayette's Travels Through the Western New York Region, and I will also tell you a little bit about my ideas about how I approach this book. So I've written several books, some of which have to do with history, and each time I write about it, I learn a little bit more about what not to do. So the guy over here that you see, his name is Heraclitus. Anybody ever meet Heraclitus? He was a pretty cool guy, ancient Greece philosopher. He said that you could never step into the same river twice. Now, that sounds kind of silly, right? Because the river's there, and you could go in and out and in and out, and you're in the same river, right? No, because you step in the river once, take your foot out, you step into a different river, even though it's a moment later. Why? Because the water has moved downstream. So it's not the same river, so to speak. The name's the same, but the water's different. And what does that tell you? Especially if you're writing about history. If you're writing about history, you have to be really careful that you don't think you're stepping into the river today. The river that you're stepping into, that water went way, way downstream a long time ago. So if you want to write about history and really write about it in a way that allows both you and the reader to understand what's going on, you're going to have to figure out how to go back in time. So, what I'm going to ask you to do today is join me on my time machine. And it's a sort of an exploration thing. So I'll put on my explorer's hat. So I'll drop my explorer's hat. There we go. Now I look the part of an explorer. So the cool thing about this is when you go back, and anybody ever watch the TV show Quantum Leap? It's about a guy who leaps back into time or leaps in different time periods. And they have this saying, they say, well, if you leap too much, your mind turns into Swiss cheese. Meaning in the show, it means that you forget things. But in reality, as a historical explorer, those holes are rabbit holes. And you go down them. They're not necessarily the thing you were initially trying to discover, but they're so interesting and so cool that you want to go and dive deep into them. So let's start off with the time period that we're talking about. We're talking about Lafayette. Lafayette is a hero of two worlds, both on our side and on the European side. Instrumental in the Revolutionary War. You know, one of the things that surprises me when I do these talks, now you guys probably know who Lafayette is or else you wouldn't have been here, but a lot of times, especially with younger people, they say Lafayette, they think for a moment and they say, oh yeah, he was in Hamilton. No, it's Lafayette is a real historical person that was instrumental in the Revolutionary War. He was also a teenager when he came here. Now his real father, died when he was young, and he inherited the title Marquis, and he also inherited a lot of money. His mother remarried, and he was raised to some extent by his stepfather, but also his grandfather. And he decided he was going to come to America and fight for the patriot cause. And his father says, like most fathers would say, no, probably not a smart idea. Now his father was aware of the diplomatic problems that might occur if a French aristocrat would go help the patriots, especially given what's going on between France and Great Britain. So his father says no. Lafayette's a teenager. What does a teenager do when a parent says no? He does it anyway. Lafayette's also not only a teenager, he's a rich teenager. So he buys his own boat and comes to America. And this is a common thing that occurs during the Revolutionary War. Lafayette had no problem buying things for himself or for soldiers, helping the cause. He was a military expert, or he became a military expert, wounded in battle. I mean, he earned his stripes. He didn't get general just because, hey, I like this guy, I'm going to call him general. No, he earned it. And by the time 1824, 1825 came about, when he did his tour, he was the last surviving general of the Revolutionary War. And that's sort of important because what was going on in America in 1825? Oops, wrong button. There we go. The War of 1812 was gone a decade before. The War of 1812 finally solidified America's independence from Great Britain. It wasn't just, when the war ended, it wasn't all that great because there were some economic troubles, panics, depressions, things like that. But very quickly, the prosperity of America came about and people really got happy. They were happy, yay. In fact, they were so happy that the era is known as the era of good feelings. James Monroe was president. He ran for re-election in 1820. Who opposed him? Trick question. No one. It never happened again. And it only happened once before. What other president ran for re-election and was not opposed? Washington. Come on, you guys can speak out loud. You don't need a microphone. I don't need a microphone. You don't need a microphone. George Washington. Imagine the respect we have for George Washington today. They had the same respect back then. So, in a sense, Monroe was kind of like George Washington. He was a founding father. He knew George Washington. He was part of that crowd. There were several others like that still around. But in terms of the Revolutionary War itself, George Washington was the greatest, and everyone just admired him. And he was the only general, and Lafayette was the only remaining general who was there with Washington close. There was a close bond between Washington and Lafayette. How close was the bond? Lafayette came with two other people when he traveled to America in 1824, 1825. One was his traveling secretary, a guy by the name of Lavasseur, who wrote a book about it afterwards, which gives us a lot of the detail that we know about when he came. His son also came with him. His son's name? George Washington Lafayette. He named his own son after George Washington. So imagine you're an American and Lafayette's coming, and you're kind of getting this patriotic fervor because it's about to be the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Everyone wants to really thank the veterans of the Revolutionary War. It's a generation that's now dying off, so there's fewer and fewer of them. And Lafayette comes. So you get to do two things at the same time. Monroe understood this. That's why he wanted Lafayette to come. He invited Lafayette to come over. When Lafayette finally got the free time to do it, he said, yes, Congress passed a law, making the invitation formal, saying, we'll send a boat over to pick you up. What's Lafayette's response? No problem, I got it. He took his own boat over. So this is Lafayette being Lafayette, coming here, and America being America, really enjoying the fact that Lafayette was there. So the stories that I'm going to tell you about Western New York aren't just Western New York stories. They're stories about the entirety of America, and you'll see in a moment where exactly Lafayette went to. Now, there's Monroe. He was pretty popular. Wait, Monroe County? James Monroe? Monroe County was created in 1821. He was the president. Whoa, all right, that's pretty cool. All right, so what was going on in the greater Western New York region in 1825? 1825 is the year that the Erie Canal was opened. At the time Lafayette came over, it was not fully completed. So all the benefits of the Erie Canal had yet to occur, which means that most of Western New York was still native forest. A lot of it was native forest. When you look and see what the places that Lafayette went to in 1825, Rochester, Buffalo, makes sense, right? Canandaigua, Geneva, okay, yeah, if you want to get that small town flavor. Whoa, you're stepping into the river of today. Back then, Canandaigua and Geneva, those were the big places to go-to places whenever you came to Western New York. Rochesterville, that's what it was called then, Rochesterville and Buffalo were little pipsqueak, barely villages sort of areas. They're no more known than, say, at that time now, than Fredonia, or, places like that. Lockport was maybe a little bit bigger, only because they were building the canal and they had a lot of workers there. But those are small, really pioneer posts almost, when Lafayette came through. And it was interesting that even though those places maybe had a few thousand people at most, every time there was an event for Lafayette, thousands of people showed up, sometimes tens of thousands of people showed up. Even a place like Rochester, which is kind of off the beaten track. Remember, the canal wasn't being used that much now. The main road, east-west, was the state road, which is now Route 20. So that's where all the big places were. That's where it's supposed to be easier to get to. So, Lafayette decides he wants to come here to America first. Let's go back now to America. And there was competition among different cities, port cities, as to who would receive Lafayette first. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, even Washington, all vied for the opportunity to be the first place for Lafayette to land on this farewell tour. So he ends up picking New York City, that's the picture of New York City in 1825. And he shows up on I should take a step back. Like everybody else, again, you'll see this repeated no matter how big or how small the communities he goes to see. There is a committee of arrangements or a welcoming committee that is set up weeks in advance in the case of New York, preparing for his arrival. Because as soon as he shows up, they want balloons, parades, music, everything, excitement, bringing him in and just having a big, huge party. So, imagine that. As soon as I guess today it's like if you think of a celebrity coming off of an airplane terminal or whatever, stepping off the airplane, everyone's there, music, exciting, surprise. So Lafayette shows up in New York Harbor, sends somebody in to talk to the mayor, say, hey, Lafayette's here, what do you guys want to do? The mayor looks at him and says, gee, it's a Sunday, things are kind of quiet on Sundays. Why doesn't he come tomorrow? So Lafayette's first night wasn't in New York City. It was in Staten Island, in the vice president's house. So that's where he stayed. But the next day, Monday, that's when all the big festivities started. And they were really nonstop. So Lafayette went from, say, New York to Albany to New York to Boston to New York to Philadelphia to Washington to Virginia, back to New York, or Washington and New York. And that was pretty much from August to November of 1824. Big, huge party, nonstop, meeting all these old friends that he saw, a lot of these Revolutionary War guys, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, James Madison, people like that he met with, had great talks with, and a lot of those talks are recorded for history, not recorded like a radio show or something like that, written down, recorded. So you get a sense for what he was talking about. He did not really initially plan to stay beyond that. But as he was going through that first segment of his tour, he kept getting invitations from all over the United States. Because remember, all over the United States, people were having this patriotic feeling and they wanted to experience Lafayette. They wanted to shake the hand that shook George Washington's hand. So Lafayette says, okay, I'm not really doing anything. I'll stay another 8 months or so. And there you can see he goes through the rest of the country, all 24 states, because that's how many states there were back in 1824, 1825. Florida's not yet a state, so that's not a stop in Florida, that's a stop in Alabama. And notice the travel ways that he takes. Those squiggly lines, those are mostly rivers. Lafayette preferred to travel on water because the roads weren't really that great, as we'll find out in Chautauqua County when we go there. So, for the most part, it was safe, and it was the preferred way of traveling. No, there's no robbers hiding in the middle of rivers to jump on you. But, like plane travel, when there's catastrophe. It tends to be sort of a catastrophe. And in Ohio, Lafayette's boat sunk in the middle of the night. Lafayette's sleeping. The boat starts taking on water. His son says, Dad, we got to get off the boat. It's sinking. Lafayette, groggy. What? Okay, yeah, in a few minutes. No, Dad, now we got to get off the boat. So Lafayette is trudging down. He's 67 years old, but he's spry for 67. But it's in the morning or in the middle of the night. So he's still trudging down. I think, oh, wait, hold it. I forgot this thing. And his son goes, no, Dad, we got to get off the boat. So he gets off the boat, and Lafayette lost a lot of stuff. Papers, his hat, even something that George Washington gave him. Now, some of those things were later found and recovered because it was a river. They knew where it sunk. They could find it. And they were returned to Lafayette. But still, even despite that, walking through the water before sunrise, he still preferred the boats. That actually comes up again in Western New York, as we will see in a moment. So, let's see. Where do we start? This is where he traveled through Western New York. You can see he comes up through Erie, and then he leaves off the map there is Syracuse. So we're going to talk very quickly about what he's doing in this area. Now, there's this one, like, double branch there, sort of in the middle, between Mendon and Canandaigua. That's the mystery. We don't know which way he took from Mendon to Canandaigua. And I'll elaborate more on that, probably spend more time on you than usual on that part, given where I'm at. And we'll see what it looks like there. So, first, Greater Western New York in 1825. You notice that, again, here's the paths. I have these things in red. These are roads for the most part. The blue part is water, and the green part are roads that are not critical to what I'm about to tell you. So these roads, and so think about the people who are coming from the east through Western New York, they're going to be taking these roads. What's significant about these roads? These roads were really revealed when the glaciers left New York State. Whoa, spoiler alert, where did that come from? Oh, interesting. That is, by the way, the Mendon Hotel. Do you know that the saying, George Washington slept here? Okay, is that always true? Is that ever true? Very rarely is it true. So for Lafayette, it's Lafayette ate here. Everyone says Lafayette ate here. Lafayette stopped over and had a couple of cocktails. Probably not true, but there's a lot of stories of that. So, but it is a spoiler that I just said this, and it's not about Mendon. Going back to this, notice this is New York State, how it looks like now from a geological standpoint. See those ridges and lines just below Lake Ontario and just above the brown spots and along the side of Lake Erie? Those are escarpments. Those escarpments later became roads, and I'm going to go right through this really fast because this is not a geological presentation. But that's what Lafayette traveled on. The Niagara Escarpment is the one just below Lake Ontario. The Onondaga Escarpment goes in the middle, like where Route 20 is. It's also, if you go on the thruway, right before Batavia, you see the Fallen Rock Zone. Remember that? How many people have ever seen fallen rocks there? I think it's false advertising. I go through there all the time. I never see fallen rocks. But it's really cool. That's the Onondaga Escarpment. People also think that it was caused by a fault, but that's not true. However, it is true. There's a fault over there, too. Two different geological things going on at the same time. And then the last thing is this Portage Escarpment. The Portage Escarpment really is key to Lafayette coming in from Erie on what was then the Buffalo and Erie Road, now Route 20 down there, the main road southwest, I guess, just off Lake Erie. So those are the roads that he's taking. Now, about that road, the Buffalo and Erie Road, we can thank Connecticut a bit for what occurred over there. Why? Do you remember the sneak preview I showed you? How there was some question about who owned the land? Well, Connecticut was involved in that. As far as New York State was involved, it was resolved before the end of the Revolutionary War. However, there was a portion of Connecticut that extended into Ohio, the northwestern portion of Ohio, northern Ohio. And it's still called, to some extent, the Connecticut Reserve. So if you see the name reserve in anything in Ohio, that's why. Ohio, or Connecticut, wanted to send people from Connecticut to this Connecticut Reserve in what would become Ohio, and there was two ways they could get there. The southern way, through Pittsburgh, which was longer and really a problem. People didn't like going that way. And then the northern way, which was through New York and western New York. You can see that north-south line, that's Route 20, that's the state road, if that's what it was called then. That was a pretty well-developed road. But this part from Buffalo to Erie, that was not well-developed at all. In fact, it was so bad that these settlers from Connecticut preferred to come over during the winter. You know why? Lake Erie was frozen. So it was easier for them to go on Lake Erie than to go down this road. So Connecticut sends this guy. We can skip this part. He sends this guy. His name is Edward Payne. He rose to the rank of a general. He was General Payne. And he was a General Payne. He was in charge of building the road supposedly from Buffalo to Erie and into Cleveland. But he gave up at a place called Portland. Everybody know where Portland is in Chautauqua County? Okay, that's good, because it's not the same Portland today. There is a town of Portland there, but in 1825, the place that's called Portland is today called, Westfield, that's the name of it. So he ended the road there, and then he went all the way down to Ohio, settled with his family, and remained there. And he actually did some pretty good stuff down there, so much good that they built a statue for him and put it up in some park. That's in Ohio. In the meantime, Joseph Ellicott takes over, and he wants this road completed in much better condition. So he comes up with ideas on what has to happen, how wide the road has to be, what trees get to be dug up, and what trees just are cut down to stump size. It's very specific, it's very detailed what he did. And he hires his brother and another guy to build roads from, again, today's Westfield to Erie, but one starts in Erie, one starts in Westfield, and bam, they meet right there at the New York state line. So this happens well before Lafayette comes. That's the main road. They start delivering mail on it, and it's used a lot. Now, how does Lafayette come into this? We don't care about Ridge Road here or the canal at this point. So, Lafayette was originally supposed to go from Erie to Buffalo by boat. Remember, his preferred method of travel is on water. So that's what was supposed to happen. And it's interesting, when you read the newspapers from 1825, from May of 1825, you will see salacious articles about an argument that occurred in Erie, Pennsylvania, between the captain of the steamship Superior and people making arrangements for Lafayette's travels. And it really looks like gossip, right? You know, when you read it, it sounds like gossip. So much so, this is how bad it was, that Lafayette himself wrote a letter to the editor back saying, hey, you know, Captain, great guy, we had no problem. It wasn't something that we really wanted to do. All this stuff about us not agreeing to the money or him trying to overcharge us, which were the claims, not true, not true. We just wanted to go a different way. And that's how he ended up coming through the first part of Western New York, which is down there. Now, we needed somebody to pay for it. This guy by the name of Walter Smith, who was a very well-to-do guy from, well, Westfield at the time. In the end, he goes to Dunkirk. But he pays for Lafayette's travels along this road. And this is ultimately the way that Lafayette took. It is this section between Erie and, well, Fredonia on the map here, that is so bad. Levasseur, the traveling secretary, when he writes in his journal, he says, whoa, this is bad. This is a bad road. This is so bumpy, we can't relax or rest at all. This is in the middle of the night, by the way, or in the evening. He's trying to get some rest because he knows he's got to stop at Westfield, Fredonia, and Dunkirk before he picks up the boat to Buffalo, the Superior. So we know that he was still friends with the captain because he rode that boat. So they couldn't fall asleep, they couldn't rest at all. Supposedly, now this is where you get into some of the issues when you retell the history. What history are you retelling? Are you retelling the history that really happened, or are you retelling the history that somebody else imagined? We know that there was a slight delay in him arriving in Westfield because the contemporary newspapers reported that. We don't know why there was a slight delay. About 60 years later, the granddaughter of one of the masters of ceremonies of the Westfield Fredonia visit, and the daughter of a father who was 9 years old at the time that Lafayette came, retold the story that she heard from her family. In that story, Lafayette's carriage breaks down. That was the cause of the delay. So again, do we know if that really happened? We don't know. Is it plausible? Well, he was delayed somehow, and maybe that was why. So he's delayed, he shows up in Westfield, maybe 10 o'clock? 10 o'clock at night? They have a big party, and then he says, oh, we gotta go to Fredonia. He shows up at Fredonia. Remember, he woke up at sunrise that day for events in Pennsylvania before leaving Erie at 3 o'clock. So he's been awake all day, and he knows that he's gotta go to Fredonia, and he's gotta go to the Fredonia party. The Fredonia party starts at 1 or 2 in the morning. It's not just like dignitaries either. It's the whole community, not just Fredonia, but all around, from all the small towns around. Thousands of people are there, men, women, children, doesn't matter. And it's in the middle of the night, in early June. I don't know how warm it was. But at some point, Levasseur reports that Lafayette said, you know, it's kind of getting chilly out. We got to go to Dunkirk. We don't want the women and children to be out here in the cold much longer. Why don't we head to Dunkirk? So they go to Dunkirk. Women and children and the men, they don't go home. They follow him to Dunkirk. So they didn't want to let go of Lafayette. Lafayette goes to Dunkirk, 7 o'clock in the morning. Now Dunkirk, you think of Dunkirk as a city now? 25 families were living in Dunkirk at that time. The forest, the original forest was still almost up to the shore. And when they fired the cannons, the Superior was about a mile offshore. They fired the cannons to welcome Lafayette, or signal that Lafayette's coming. You could hear the echoes of those cannons off the forest wall. So in the morning, as the sun is rising, Lafayette is in the little dinghy, going off to the Superior, riding on the Superior to Buffalo. And it takes about maybe 5 or 6 hours. Well, no, actually, by the time he lands, it takes 7 hours. Why? It only took 5 hours to get within sight of the Buffalo Harbor. But it took 2 hours to land in the harbor. Why? Because the winds died. They had problems with the winds. They couldn't get the boat in. So it took a while to get into Buffalo. But eventually he does get into Buffalo. He spends the day and night in Buffalo. Next morning he goes to Black Rock, and then he says goodbye to Black Rock at 10 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, June 5th. And from there he goes up to Niagara Falls. I'm sorry, he switches, take a step back here. The canal had just opened in Buffalo, like a day or two before. So Lafayette rides the Seneca Chief from Buffalo, really from Black Rock. So he's at Black Rock that night at Peter Porter's house. Peter Porter's house, if anybody's ever been on the 190 in Buffalo and you pass by Rich Products, that's where Peter Porter's house was. It was overlooking Black Rock right there. And the canal, you could see on this picture's from, drawing, is from 1825. The Niagara River is on the left side, sort of going along the shoulder, following the river, is the canal. So that's how the canal was designed, from Black Rock into the interior, all the way to Tonawanda. And that's what Lafayette did. So he's only on the boat for maybe a couple of hours from Black Rock to Tonawanda. And by the way, they didn't call it Tonawanda then, they called it Tonawanda. It was very confusing. I had to talk to the historian there because I was so confused as to what was what. but she was able to tell me. So at, uh-oh, there we go. There we go. By noon, he's there in Tonawanda, and then from Tonawanda, he heads over to a place called Manchester. Anybody ever been to Manchester? Yes? This Manchester. You said you've been to Manchester.
Yes.
This Manchester?
Yep.
What's it called now? Niagara Falls.
Oh, my goodness.
Back then it was Manchester. So imagine trying to do historical research and you're seeing names like Manchester. I'm thinking Manchester, whatever, east of here. So, Manchester, big place where the Lehigh Valley hung out. So I like railroads too. So. But not Manchester as in Niagara Falls, but that's where he was. And there's a funny story about when he gets to Niagara Falls. There's a guy who owns the hotel there. That's where he stays at. Or I shouldn't say stays at, that's where he has breakfast at. And, or lunch, I guess, at this point. The guy is a big burly guy. And he comes up and he hugs Lafayette, picks him up, big burly guy, picking up Lafayette, short little French guy. Lafayette's feet are dangling in the air, and he carries him through the threshold into the hotel for dinner. And now, Levasseur, when he writes about this, kind of is very abrupt, sort of signaling that maybe Lafayette didn't appreciate that too much. He says something like, we cut the dinner short. We got out of there as soon as we could. In so many words. He didn't say it as nasty as that, because he's French and he speaks really eloquently. But that's kind of the way it reads. Is that really what happened? We don't know for sure, but we do know that when Lafayette got back to France after the tour was done, he sent the proprietor of that hotel a pewter chandelier, which was very, very nice looking and that was the centerpiece of the hotel until the hotel burned down. By the way, most of the buildings that I'm talking about, unless I say otherwise, probably burned down, because that's just the way it is back then. So he goes from Manchester up to Lewiston, where he spends the night. Well, he hangs out at Augustus Porter's Goat Island. At that point, Augustus Porter owns Goat Island. And at this point, this is where Lafayette sees Niagara Falls. And he's so impressed. He actually spends more time there than he was originally allotted to. He just loved it. He actually kind of almost hittingly asks Porter, hey, ever think about selling this? And Porter, who was thinking about selling it, says, yeah, got $1,000, I'll sell it to you. And it took Lafayette a little bit of time to realize he was too old to buy it. If he was younger, he might have bought it. So he leaves Goat Island and goes to Lewiston. Lewiston, he stays at Kelsey's Tavern. This is an example of one of these Lafayette A. Here stories, possibly. We get a story from Kelsey's daughter, who said that she was greeted by Lafayette and treated very kindly to him. There's a story about his daughter meeting Lafayette here in the tavern. So I tried to do some genealogical research. I could not find any evidence or anything that he had a daughter. This story came out years later, so I don't know if it really happened or if it's just what she wanted to say. But Lafayette did stay at Kelsey's Tavern. From there, he goes up to Fort Niagara on the morning of June 6th. So now we're getting closer to where he's going to be coming through here. So this is the day before he comes here. In the morning, he goes to Fort Niagara. He's had a short sleep in Buffalo before going to Black Rock. And then another short sleep here in Lewiston. So he's waking up, he's going to bed after midnight. He's waking up before 6 o'clock in the morning. So he's not, he's getting his 4-hour sleep cycle in, but not much more than that. So really early in the morning, he gets up and he goes to Fort Niagara, and he sees the troops there. Remember, Fort Niagara at one point was owned by the French. In fact, the French built it. Then it was owned by the British, and then it was owned by the Americans. So the British weren't really celebrated too much at this point here because the French and the Americans were there. But they had a good time in Fort Niagara, and after that, he left Fort Niagara, went down Ridge Road, which is why I talked about Ridge Road earlier, and then to Lockport. And in Lockport, he's coming in on the Palisades area, and the first thing he sees as he gets into Lockport, more into the center part of Lockport, is the 5 steps of the Erie Canal. Not completed yet. They're still working on it. So as soon as the people there see him, what do? Big, huge explosions. They didn't have cannons. They also didn't have dynamite, but they had powder that made explosions. So that's what they did. Lafayette is rained on by rocks. And, but he's okay. And they were small rocks. But that was a celebration for him. And this is common. There's always cannon fire and things like that when Lafayette shows up. So he spends the time looking at what's going on in Lockport, checking out the canal, having dinner again, because he's always having dinner. And at the dinner he toasts, to the greatest wonder of nature, Niagara Falls, and the greatest wonder of mankind, the 5 steps of the Erie Canal. So he notes that specifically, how big of a thing that is from a technological standpoint. So now he leaves after having dinner and meeting with the Masons there. This is interesting. He met with the Masons in Lockport. And the minutes of that meeting were actually published in the New York Times in 1865. They're very boring. We met, these guys were here, Lafayette was here, we ended. Regular corporate kind of minutes. So you're not seeing any kind of secrets. Those are the minutes, by the way. So he leaves for Rochester on a canal boat in Lockport at 7 o'clock at night on June 6th. He comes and arrives at Rochester at 6 o'clock in the morning. That night, according to Lafayette, he had the best sleep ever. 12 hours, which is about how long it took a boat to go from Lockport to Rochester, on this, not the choppy waters of a lake or even the current of a stream, but the steady waters of the canal. And the only kind of maybe disturbance there is when he's in a lock. He goes up, he goes down, he goes straight up, straight down. How many of you guys have been on the locks? Okay. I guess it's kind of noisy filling up, but he's a sound sleeper, so he slept. He gets to Rochester around 6 o'clock, or Rochesterville, I'm sorry, Rochesterville, again, stepping in the river twice. They find out he's coming, and they send a bunch of boats from the point where they're going to meet him out down the canal. And a guy by the name of Samson steps off the boat, or he walks, I should say, he walks down the towpath of the canal. The boats stop. He sees which one Lafayette's on. He steps on the boat to greet Lafayette. Now, Samson, he was actually in Lockport, came over earlier, and he was also the head of the welcoming committee. So it was his job to welcome, in an unofficial way, Lafayette. W.B. Rochester would do the formal welcome a little later on. So Samson goes on the boat. Did you ever meet somebody who's so famous you're just awestruck and you don't know what to say? So you can imagine, this is how Samson described it, not quite this way. Again, this is like much later when he's interviewed for it. So I'm going to give you kind of like a modern version. So he's really nervous. What do I say? What do I say? It's Lafayette. I gotta be cool. Gotta say something. Gotta make sure that he doesn't think I'm nuts. And so finally he goes up to him. Welcome, Lafayette. He says it just like he says it. And Lafayette says, oh, hi, how you doing? And then leaves. That's too emotional. Samson says Lafayette was really not emotional at all, just perfunctory. Oh, hi. Which is so unusual, because Lafayette, in almost every speech where he's quoted, is just so ebullient. Like that word, ebullient. And he impressed everybody that he met that way. So Samson says, gee whiz, I'm not impressed. And then when Lafayette actually goes to Rochester, and when he goes to Rochester, by the way, he gets off the boat. Lavasseur writes this. They stop in the middle of, they don't know this. This is where they're meeting here. So they go back to the aqueduct, and they stop right in the middle of the aqueduct. And that's where the welcome thing is. So Lafayette and his party get off the boat thinking that there's going to be land there, and there's nothing there. It's a big drop in the water. So that was kind of shocking initially. But then they saw this platform, and they said, oh, okay, this is where they're welcoming us. And they do that, and like I say, W.B. Rochester, who is Nathaniel Rochester's son, is the one who gives the formal address. Lafayette responds in kind, and it's a nice address, and everyone's happy. When they get back on the boat, there's the aqueduct. Now, everyone knows that's not the same aqueduct that we see today. This is the original aqueduct that lasted about 10 years and then was replaced by the one that we see today. So they get on the boat, back on the boat, and then they go down to the canal to a place called Gilbert's Basin down there. Where that is today is sort of like that mess of interchange with 490, how to get on a 490 and all that. So it's not that far down. And at this point, he gets off and goes into a carriage with Nathaniel Rochester. And from there, he rides through the streets of Rochester over to a place called Hoard's Tavern. Hoard's Tavern is Hoard is married to someone who's French, who knows Lafayette through the French connection. Not that kind of French. So they meet there, and this is where he meets the veterans, including a veteran by the name of Timothy Barnard. Timothy Barnard lives in Mendon and is a veteran of the Revolutionary War. Actually served under Lafayette and Washington. And Lavasseur, in his book, says that Lafayette, I couldn't tell, this is Lavasseur talking, he said, I can't tell if Lafayette was just being nice or if he really did remember the veterans that he said that he remembered. Because you know how you meet somebody that you haven't seen in a long time, you know them, but you can't remember their name, and, oh, yeah, hi, oh, how you been? You know, you totally don't give away that you don't know who they are. But you're nice. So he's thinking maybe Lafayette's the same way. When it came to Timothy Barnard, though, so Barnard, again, kind of shy, walks, and this is Sampson's story, by the way. Sampson's telling the story a little while later. Kind of shy, goes up to Lafayette, like everybody else. So Barnard doesn't think he's any more special than anybody else, in other words. So he's going to go and say hi to Lafayette. And before he can say anything, Lafayette says, Timothy Barnard! Holy cow, I can't believe you're here! How you doing? Now, Barnard, obviously, pretty much the same age as Lafayette. They must have got together. I don't know how. I know that he served for Lafayette, but Barnard's main job was a carrier. He carried the payroll. You know, imagine George Washington. You see George Washington in the Revolutionary War. Okay, he's already famous. He's like this great guy. You're going to work for George Washington. Who says no to that? Barnard was so excited. All right, what do you want me to do? I'll do anything you want me to do. George Washington says, say, could you carry the soldiers paid so they could get paid? No problem, no problem. How many bodyguards are you going to give me? And what? And I'm going to take the main roads, right? Washington says, you're not going to get any bodyguards and you're not going to take the main roads. Barnard says, what? Why am I not getting any bodyguards? So George Washington tells him, so imagine you're a thief and you see a bunch of bodyguards. Do you think they're guarding something valuable? Ooh. And do you think they're going to be on the main road instead of the side roads? Oh. Timothy Barnard says, that's why you're the general and I'm just this little paymaster here. So he was there, and then he was also at Yorktown, and that's where he worked with Lafayette. So they definitely knew each other. There was a report that was not substantiated in any contemporary newspapers that Barnard met with Lafayette in Mendon, but it's not likely that happened. Certainly there was no initial greeting in Mendon. It's possible Barnard might have come with Lafayette, traveled with Lafayette to Mendon, maybe not. So anyways, after Hoard's Tavern, there's a plaque there, if you want to go to downtown Rochester to see where it was. They go to a place called Christopher's Mansion. Last name is Christopher, not first name. And they have the formal dinner there, and from there is when they take off and they leave Rochester, and this is the Barnard story, and then they go to Mendon. And they arrive at Mendon some point after 4 p.m., because they leave Rochester at 4 p.m. At Mendon, they switch carriages from the Rochester committee to the Canandaigua committee. This is a very common thing, a handoff from one committee to the other. This is where things get interesting. So we know he was at Mendon. We know he ended up in Canandaigua, because that was what was written in the contemporary newspapers. What we don't know is exactly, am I going backwards? There. We don't know exactly how he did it. Now I say this wasn't supposed to happen because a lot of people thought Lafayette was going to take the canal all the way to Albany from Lockhart. And it was uncertain if they could convince him to come and visit their towns. So the Canandaigua committee was proactive. When Lafayette was in Buffalo, they sent a couple of guys to Buffalo. And they said, hey, can you come to Canandaigua? And Lafayette never says no. So he says, yeah, sure, I'll go to Canandaigua. Yay, they go back to Canandaigua, tell everybody in Canandaigua to get ready. Are you sure he's coming? So this is the day before. He said, yeah, okay, he's coming for sure. Everything goes. Start working on it. That day, that morning, they're still not quite convinced he's coming to Canandaigua. The same two guys are sent to Rochester. And they say, General, just making sure you're coming to Canandaigua, right? And he says, yeah, I'm coming to Canandaigua. So then they go back and they say, yeah, he's definitely coming. Definitely get everything ready, get the cannons ready to fire, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So he goes down, now Lafayette, back to our regular story. He goes to Mendon, then what happens? Well, we know he goes from Mendon to Canandaigua, but there's two ways he could go. One takes him through Victor. The other one takes him through Bloomfield. At that point, Bloomfield is probably going to be a preferred method. Both of these end up being mail routes and stage routes. It took me a long time to figure this out. So they're both very eligible in terms of the travel. What is the evidence that we have that he went through Victor? Well, the earliest thing that I could find was, I think, an 1898 story. I don't know, Babette, if you have anything more earlier than that. But it was an 1898 History of Victor thing. And then in 1942, the history of the Dreyer family just mentions this kind of like in an offhand way and makes reference to a woman by the name of Talmridge, Louisa West Talmridge, I think that's her name, who lives in Fishers, who supposedly saw Lafayette on Wagnum Road and told how he went to the Beach Tavern. So all these places are real. So that's kind of, it's not a contemporary eyewitness report. It is sort of an eyewitness report because she was 9 years old at the time, but it's not contemporary. It's told decades later, 60, 80 decades later. So it's tough to know, okay, did this really happen the way it's described? I was trying to find the obituary. I talked to the Fisher brothers, Douglas and Lewis, who wrote about this, and I asked them what sources did you get? Because I couldn't find anything. And they said, well, it's the obituary. Look her obituary up. So I looked up her obituary in the Victor Herald. So this is the Victor Herald. That's her obituary. That's her picture there. Now, I know it's tough to read from late. So I blew it up so I could read it, and that's what it looked like. So it's even harder to read when you blow it up. Actually, it's easier to read on the screen here than it is on my computer for some reason. Maybe I'll read it this way and see if I can make out all the words. You definitely make out her name in a couple of places. But it's a very, very bad copy. This is one thing I hate as a researcher. A lot of these old newspapers and old deeds, especially deeds, they were mimeographed or copied when the technology was really bad. And I know Monroe County, they did this, I don't remember when, but before a certain date, they destroyed all the original documents. So I can't go back. If there's a glitch on the copy, I can't go back on the original and see what it looks like. I mean, it's bad enough going back to the original and you get Fs instead of S's. So that's confusing. And the worst part of it is that they're not consistent. The same article will have the actual S with the F. It's like they ran out of the little S's and they had to use F's instead. Make me think, if you're a publisher back then, why don't you budget more for the S's and less for the F's? Because you're using more F's. Anyways, so it's hard to read this. I couldn't read it. I don't know about that, if you know if you could get if you have a better copy or something of this.
I can check.
Yeah, they said you got it, so I don't know. But who knows? Anyway, so I went to the DNC and the Times-Union. They also had the obituaries. Nothing. Couldn't, there was no mention. I was able to read both of those, but there was no mention of her in Lafayette. So I don't have something that really says what she says. I only have things that say from other people saying she said this. So we don't know if it's true. The one piece of evidence that we do have that I think is most favorable to Victor is the fact that the carriage driver for Canandaigua, that's okay, was the owner of a carriage unit that did the mail from Victor to Canandaigua through Mendon. So we know that that was a route that he took. But we also know the other route down here was possible and profitable, or, you know, a good thing to go. So how do I conclude which way he takes? I don't know, I'm just guessing, but here's how I guess. For one thing, we have to look at Louis West's memory and Talmadge's memory and see how correct it is. So think of me, picture in your mind what you would think Lafayette was wearing when he does this tour. All right? I'm going to tell you what she said. She said he was wearing a long black coat, a ruffled shirt, and a tall top hat, and also a gold brooch. All right? So fancy jewelry, very elegant dress, top hat, long black coat. How many people had that image in their mind before I said that? How many people? My mother did too. By the way, this is my mother, so if you want to be mean to me, you got to go through her. Well, what do we know about Lafayette's wardrobe at the time? We don't know precisely what he was wearing, but we do have bits and pieces along the way, including a diary from someone in Canandaigua. We know he wasn't wearing a hat. Lavaseur says he comes out of his boat, he doesn't, or comes out and greets people, he doesn't have a hat, which is normal. Why? Because he wants people to see his face. And if you're wearing a hat, sometimes it's hard to see your face, especially at night. At Canandaigua, he didn't, after dinner, after like sundown, sunset, it's nighttime now, he's coming out on the balcony and they're lighting candles underneath his face so people could see his face. And he apologizes to everyone. I wish I was here in the daytime so you could see me, but this is the best I can do. So no hat, because he wants people to see him. He didn't wear a black coat. By the way, remember that boat crash? One of the things he lost was his hat. But it doesn't mean he couldn't get one again later. The coat was a short black citizen's coat. So Lafayette did not like being called Marquis. It was okay to call him General, because that's what he was here in America, but he didn't want to put on the trappings of an aristocrat. So he wore a citizen's frock, almost. I think you can, yeah, sort of make it out in the picture in the book. There's a longer picture that shows it. But so if you're remembering what he wore 80 years ago, a lot of what might influence you is what you think he would wear. And so maybe that's why she had that quote. And if that quote, and again, I don't know if that's her actual quote. This is just a tertiary source on that quote. But if that's really what she said, maybe the memory's not right. If she does say that she saw him on Wagner Road, she was 9 years old, if she was living in Fishers, she went down Wagner Road, it's not that much farther to go down to the Four Corners of Mendon from Wagner Road. So she might remember Wagner Road and not remember what's now 251. Maybe, maybe not, we don't know. But here's the most interesting thing. how did he go into Canandaigua? Now I'm going to go to the picture of Canandaigua. So here are the multiple routes. The red one is Victor, and the blue one, there's going to be two blue ones, is Bloomfield. We know there was a parade in Canandaigua that started at the head of Main Street. What's not clear is what they meant by the head of Main Street. I'm assuming the northern part and not down by the lake. So where was Canandaigua at that time? This map is from 1872. So the village outline or the city outline may have changed over time. So either way, you can get to the head of Main Street if it's up top or bottom. Either way will get you there. There's another route that gets you to Canandaigua, which is, to me, the more logical route because that's the state road. That's going to be the best road to take to Canandaigua. And this branches off also into two areas, like the northern Bloomfield Road does, but it also gets you onto what might be the head of the road, the head of Main Street, which is where the parade starts. Why is it important to know where the parade starts? Because it's important to know where the parade ends. The parade ends at, here we go again with this over here, I'm showing these things here. So this is a close-up look at the interior of the village. The parade ends right where Blossom Hotel is. Blossom Hotel, I'll get to that with other stuff first. That's the Blossom Hotel. That's where the parade ends. So that lower green route, he can't take that route, because then he's now at the head of Main Street to go on the parade. He's got to take one of the other routes. All three routes that I showed you end up at the head of Main Street, so they're all possible. What's the one difference that I've been able to find out? He was greeted by cannon fire from Arsenal Hill before he reached his destination. Arsenal Hill is that first star on the left there. So we know he didn't take that green arrow that's right next to Arsenal Hill. He had to take one of the ones that were there. Which of those routes is easiest to see well before he ends up in a spot? I'm thinking that green one up top is easier for Arsenal Hill to see. So that's where I'm banking on it, just based on the Arsenal Hill story. Not knowing if it's true or not, but so far, based on the data that I've got, I'm leaning towards that one. Although I will also say it's very compelling that the stagecoach owner takes the Victor route normally. And I'm a little bit, I can't explain necessarily that would, in a way that would come from me, why he wouldn't take that route. But at the same time, I can't explain how Arsenal Hill can see the red route from that far away. Because remember, there's a lot of trees at this point. You're not going to be able to see them. So, anyways, I'm going to end it there because I'm a little bit over time. But he did go the rest of the way. He did pick up the rest of the canal in Syracuse after going through Geneva, Waterloo, Auburn. He drove through Seneca Falls. I don't think he stopped there, but he ended up past Skaneateles. Here we go, the rest of the way there, Skaneateles there. And then from there, he goes to Syracuse. There's Auburn, lots of fun stuff happened there. And that's it. That's his way through Western New York. And it's just interesting how Western New York, the reaction of Western New York, which I really didn't get a chance to go into that much, but the book says a lot about it, is very similar to the rest of America, how everybody responded. I want to thank you. Sorry for being a little bit 5 minutes over. If you have any questions, if you have any entertainment.
Gary, wait just a minute on the questions. Because we record this, it would be helpful if
Oh, that's a good idea.
people that have questions speak in the mic.
This is not a question, but when I first came to this,
Hold it closer.
closer,
Yeah.
when I first came to this area in 1961, there was a Lafayette Inn in Geneva.
Mm-hmm.
And some years later, there was a major fire. They tore the inn down and put in a Ponderosa restaurant. It was a beautiful building.
That just triggers so many things in my mind. First of all, everything's named after Lafayette, whether or not he stayed there or not. Even when he went, Silver Springs, New York, he didn't go through Silver Springs. But they named themselves initially Lafayette. They had to change it to Silver Springs because somebody else was named Lafayette already. Some other town was named Lafayette. In Geneva, there's a known path that he took from Canandaigua to Geneva, State Road. So we know which way he went. We know where he stopped. There was some question, though, on the some of the items on the way there ended up being more lore than real. So the hotel, I think, was definitely part of the lore thing, where he stopped and then it burned down. But in the book, I say exactly where he stopped in each of the locations based on the contemporary reports. And if the names of the places are different, so for example, in the Blossom Hotel in Canandaigua became the Canandaigua Hotel, which burned down and was replaced by another Canandaigua Hotel, which also burned down, like in 1971 or something like that. So the real hotel that he was at was long gone, and then the replacement hotel was long gone. There are a couple of places that are still around though. So if you go to Cambria in Niagara County, Howell's Tavern on Ridge Road still exists. It's a private home. It was actually a private home back then too, as most taverns were. And I actually talked to the historian from Cambria, used to live there. It was so cool. I mean, she didn't realize it for a while, but yeah, so she has a history on the house. But it's interesting just seeing what's still around and what's not around, what was called after, named for Lafayette, what wasn't named for Lafayette. All along there, you're going to see evidence of that. Thanks. Anybody else?
First of all, this sounds like an exhausting trip for him.
Yeah.
But my question is, do we have any indication of Lafayette's take on America at that point?
Oh, yeah. Oh, tons of it. Everywhere he goes, he says how much he loves America. He loves the concept of America. He loves the reality of America, the natural beauty of America. He loves the people of America. Everything about America is great. And why? Here's what he did. You remember how Lafayette never says no, right? So a year before, when he's in Boston, this is 1824, Boston says to Lafayette, next year, June 17th, 1825, is the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And we're going to make a monument. And we would really appreciate it if you would lay the cornerstone of that monument. And Lafayette says, yeah, sure. So about 9 months away or whatever, no problem. He's in Erie, Pennsylvania on June 3rd. He needs to get to Boston by June 17th. That's 2 weeks. Again, walking in today's river, we're thinking, oh, Erie to Boston? No problem. I'll meet you there for dinner. Just take the thruway all the way down. Back then, not true. I mean, he was going as fast as he could. There's only 2 or 3 times that he slept not moving, on the way there. And he still got there barely in time. So that was the reason why he was rushing through. The more amazing thing, there's no evidence that he was drinking coffee or anything like that, but he was vibrant pretty much everywhere. The only case where you get some suggestion that he was tired, no, there's 2 cases. So one was Sampson in Rochester. The other one was the kid who was in the Ontario brass band who wrote the diary the next day, said that Lafayette looked tired that night when he gave the speech to the people. But even though he looked tired, he was still saying everything from his heart with all sincerity, and the kid was impressed. I think everybody was impressed who saw it. Well, If you don't have any questions, I'll be here. You can talk to me as I'm cleaning up. If you'd like a book, I've got books. I think I can sell them, right? Is that okay? Thank you.
The delivery was great, very fun.
Thank you.